There are lots of things that we want to get around to over the course of the discussion this afternoon, and one of them is about homelessness. And before you start rolling your eyes, it's a different kind of aspect of homelessness that is not necessarily the first thing you think of, because the first thing you think of, for me, is embodied by the early 20-year-old kid that I walked by on Queen Street West on my way into the radio station, who had a sign out looking for handouts. And, you know, that's kind of naturally where my brain skews when you mention homeless people. You think younger, you think, yeah, probably a substance abuse issue, or maybe mental health, but generally you don't think of people in their 60s. And precarious housing, potential homelessness, actual homelessness among senior citizens is actually a challenge that our city and society in general faces. And joining us now to talk about it is Michael Lyster. He's the manager of development for the Homes First Society. And Michael, am I alone in this perception that, you know, younger people, and when I say younger people, I'm thinking nowhere close to senior citizen level, typically are the homeless types? Is that a sort of a natural perception that people might have?
Absolutely. First of all, thanks for having me. I think it's fair to say, although, having worked in this field for a long time, I guess, more than 20 years, you see that there is no one person that is the face of homelessness or people who are precariously housed. But I think that's right. If you were to do a sweeping shot of a city with encampments and people that are sleeping on sidewalks, you would probably tend to think of them as younger folks. And although we've all probably seen the older person, a downtown street corner, maybe panhandling or standing on a street corner, talking to themselves, and they can be an older person, male or female.
Yeah.
But that's not generally what people tend to focus on. So I think that's fair, what you said.
Michael, what is happening? What is happening here that we're seeing more elderly people or older people on the streets?
Well, it's a great question, and it's something I started to notice as becoming more and more of a concern. Again, being in this field for more than 20 years, and I was a frontline worker for most of that time, working in a housing program in downtown Toronto. And I think it's a combination of a number of things that have led to this crisis. And when I say crisis, just looking at some recent data from the city of Toronto, I think it's more than 2,500 seniors have accessed homeless shelters in the city of Toronto alone from January to April of this year. I mean, homelessness, of course, has been in the news a lot lately. The number of people needing services in Toronto has just exploded through the pandemic. But increasingly, shelters have become almost de facto long-term care programs for people over 55, 65, and plus. Now, there's some technical reasons for it, which can be complicated, but in general, seniors not every senior, most people have family supports, and that's fantastic. But if you're looking at people who are low income and maybe vulnerable, and you mentioned, like, let's say there's some mental health or even addictions, when you turn 65, there are certain things you need to do to maintain an income. And if we're talking about subsidized housing here, there's things like you need to do your taxes, you need to file for your federal pension. These things can become challenging for you or me. And if we don't have support, if you're a senior, these things can break down. And not to get too much into the weeds, but I want your listeners to know, every year in Ontario, there are hundreds, if not more, and in Toronto specifically, or thousands of seniors, vulnerable people who don't have familial support, that will lose their income. And simply from that, they will be evicted. They're not going to be able to pay their rent. They'll end up in a shelter. This happens more and more. Or perhaps they can outlive their children or their relatives that would normally, like you or me or most people, take care of an elderly relative. Again, it's a small percentage of the seniors in Ontario, but with an aging population, even a small percentage means with these vulnerable people, seniors ending up on the street or in shelters or losing their housing. And we've seen it more and more to the point where every meeting I've gone to in the last 10 years, at the end of the meeting, people look at each other and say, I have a client, who's 74 years old. They've lost their housing. They have some mental health issues. What are we going to do? And I came to the realization this is not like an underserved sector. This is a completely, at the time, unserved sector. Now, you mentioned Homes for Society. That's the organization I work for, but this is across the field. If people want to know more about it, they could just Google it. We have actually a campaign going on right now. Not to plug this, but we recognize it as an issue within our shelters. We have on any given night more than 1,500 people staying in just our shelters. We're a private organization.
Wow.
Plus, we have supportive housing, and we're trying to focus on these needs that I've mentioned. Well, first of all, awareness. Thank you again for having me, and raising funds for things like food supports, primary health care, and addressing social isolation. All of these things, play together and can end up in someone losing their housing or sometimes, frankly, walking away from the housing when they feel unsafe. If you're an isolated senior and you're living somewhere where you don't have the support you need, sometimes people will actually feel so concerned about that, they will leave their housing, and then sometimes they end up in a homeless shelter. And that's, as you can imagine, that's not a great place for anybody, much less someone who's elderly.
No, of course not. Michael Lyster is our guest. He's manager of development for the Homes First Society. So, Michael, a lot of people may be listening to this and saying, well, if you didn't plan ahead for your later years, if you didn't build up a nest egg, if you didn't, take care of business when you should have, this might happen to you. What's your response to that?
Well, I guess, that can be fair if you're thinking about yourself and you're thinking about someone who's been working, at a steady job for a long time. And again, most of the people, not all that I'm talking about who are the people we're trying to support, have been on disability most of their life. And if you, not to take a political stance, but if you, gosh forbid, you're in an accident or you can't work any longer, or let's say you do have a mental health issue, not even addressing things like addictions, that's not a lot of money.
No.
And if an ODSP, it's about $500 a month that you can pay for your shelter allowance. That is your housing. So you need subsidized housing.
Sure.
And we all know the length of those wait lists. So for the folks that we're talking about, there really wasn't an opportunity to build up a nest egg. So you can apply for the pension, and there are supplements that come along with it, but it still adds up to $20-something thousand unless you've worked a good long time, which again, most people have, but the folks we're talking about, again, they've always been vulnerable. They've been on disability for a physical ailment or other things, not been able to work. And then they're at the mercy of the systems. And again, if they don't have those supports and they can't navigate the incomes they need, they actually may lose their subsidies and they may end up homeless or in the shelters. And, won't wish that on anyone. And again, not a huge percentage of the seniors we're talking about, but given we have an aging population, this is not going to go away. In fact, it's becoming bigger and bigger. In some of our shelters, the largest demographic of the folks that we support are people 60 plus.
Wow. First I have to thank you, Michael. This has been a very eye-opening segment for me. And I got to say, I think there's got to be so many listeners out there who are thinking of people in their own families or extended families who could go down this path, who worked their entire adult lives and for whatever reasons, be it addiction, mental health issue, combination of them both, whatever, with all the combined forces coming together now, could go down this path. So thank you for highlighting this today. That was Michael Lyster. He's the manager of development at Homes First Society. And yeah,